Italy. On October 28, 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from Albania, expecting to take Athens in a few weeks and prove Italy could win a war without Hitler's help. Instead, Italy stumbled into one of the most embarrassing defeats of the Axis alliance. The terrain was brutal, mountains, snow, and rain, and the Italian army was woefully unprepared. Within days, the offensive stalled. Then, Greece counterattacked. Led by General Alexandros Papagos, Greek troops not only stopped the Italians, they pushed them into Albania, capturing nearly a quarter of Italian-held territory by December. Supply lines collapsed, morale crumbled. By midwinter, 25,000 Italians had been taken prisoner. In March of 1941, Mussolini traveled to the front to oversee a new offensive. It failed again. Italy, despite having more troops, tanks, and aircraft, couldn't break through. Greek soldiers, some in sandals, held the line. On April 6, Hitler invaded Greece to clean up Mussolini's mess. Athens fell by the end of the month, to the Germans, not to the Italians. Italy wasn't even at the surrender. The failure was total. Italy had expected a quick win. Instead, it needed rescuing. The defeat shattered Mussolini's image at home and among his own troops. Hitler later blamed the Balkan campaign for delaying Operation Barbarossa, though historians are divided on how much it really mattered. In Greece, the resistance became legend. October 28th is still celebrated as Ochi Day, No Day, honoring the moment Greece said no to Mussolini and sent his army packing. Italy expected to conquer Greece in 6 weeks. Instead, it triggered a 6-month disaster, lost thousands of men, and had to be bailed out by its own ally. For fascist Italy, it was a war that began with overconfidence and ended in humiliation. Albania. On April 7th, 1939, fascist Italy invaded Albania. Within 5 days, the country's independence was gone. Albania had been ruled by King Zog I for just over a decade, nominally independent but increasingly under Italian economic and political influence. Mussolini decided to make the relationship permanent. That morning, 22,000 Italian troops, backed by naval artillery and aircraft, landed at Durrës, Vlorë, Saranda, and Shëngjin. More reinforcements followed, bringing the total to about 35,000 troops. Albania's defenders numbered roughly 8,000, a mix of gendarmes, border guards, and poorly equipped militia. In Durrës, Major Abbas Kupi and Sergeant Mujo Ulkinaku led a brief but symbolic stand. Ulkinaku manned a water-cooled machine gun on the quay until he was killed by naval fire. Italian casualties at the landing totaled 12 killed and 24 wounded. Albanian losses were higher, around 40 dead. But elsewhere, resistance quickly collapsed. The next day, Italian forces entered Tirana without organized opposition. King Zog had already fled to Greece the previous day, carrying his family and the national gold reserve. On April 12th, a puppet Albanian parliament offered the throne to King Victor Emmanuel III, completing the annexation. The invasion was over before most countries realized it had begun. There were no last stands, no foreign intervention. The monarchy evaporated. For many Albanians, the memory of their victory over Italy at Vlorë in 1920 made the speed of collapse in 1939 even more humiliating. Italy turned Albania into a protectorate in all but name. Its army was absorbed, its economy controlled, and its men conscripted, many of them sent to die in the disastrous invasion of Greece the following year. In response, resistance slowly grew. By 1942, partisan units were active nationwide. After Italy's surrender in 1943, Germany took over, only to face even stronger insurgency. By November 1944, Albania was one of the only Axis-occupied nations liberated without Allied divisions on the ground. But the invasion had lasting consequences. Enver Hoxha later built his communist regime on the memory of Zog's flight and Albania's 5-day fall. To this day, April 7th is marked as Dita e Pushtimit, the day of invasion, a national wound, a lesson in the cost of unpreparedness. Greece. In October 1940, Greece stunned the world. Mussolini's Italy invaded from Albania, expecting a quick victory, and was instead pushed back. By December, Greek forces had crossed the border and seized Italian-held ground. It was a rare early win for the Allies and a major embarrassment for Rome. But then, Germany intervened. On April 6, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Narrator, sending panzer divisions and bombers into Greece. The Greek army, drained by 6 months of mountain warfare, was exhausted. Germany moved with speed and overwhelming force. The resistance was brave, but hopeless. German troops swept through Macedonia and Thessaly. On April 27th, they marched into Athens and then raised the swastika over the Acropolis. The photo went around the world, a gut punch to the Allied cause. General Yorgos Tsolakoglu, refusing to surrender to Italy, signed the initial capitulation with Germany alone on April 20th. Under pressure from Hitler, follow-up documents extended the surrender to Italy and Bulgaria as well. Greece's government and royal family fled into exile, first to Crete, then Egypt. The occupation began, but so did the resistance. On May 30th, just after a month after Athens fell, 2 students, Manolis Glezos and Apostolos Santas, climbed the Acropolis and tore down the Nazi flag. It was one of the first acts of defiance in occupied Europe. Underground movements quickly formed, and by 1942, Greece had one of the most active partisan networks on the continent. But the price was staggering. Greece was divided among Germany, Italy, and Bulgaria. The winter of 1941-42 brought famine, and an estimated 70,000 to 100,000 people died. Entire villages, like Kalavrita and Distomo, were burned in Nazi reprisals. Occupation sowed the seeds of future conflict, and when liberation came in 1944, civil war soon followed. Greece had gone from underdog to occupier and back to resistance in less than a year. The swastika flying over the Acropolis became a symbol of national shame, but tearing it down became something greater, the first flicker of a fight that never stopped. New Zealand. After the fall of mainland Greece in April 1941, thousands of Allied troops, including New Zealand's 2nd Division, retreated to Crete. The island was critical. Whoever held it controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean. The defense was led by New Zealand's own Major General Bernard Freyberg, a decorated World War I veteran. Freyberg had a secret advantage. Decrypted ultra-intelligence warned of an impeding German attack, but he misjudged the threat. Believing the main assault would come by sea, he spread his defenses thin, over-garrisoning the coast and underestimating the airborne threat inland. On May 20th, Hitler launched Operation Mercury, the largest airborne invasion in history. German paratroopers rained down across the island. Many were shot mid-air or overwhelmed on landing. Some units were wiped out completely. But one key position was lightly held, Maleme Airfield. That night, a miscommunication changed everything. A New Zealand battalion near Maleme believed it had been ordered to retreat. The airfield was abandoned. German forces seized it and flew in reinforcements, and that proved decisive. With control of Maleme, the Germans built strength while Allied forces scrambled to respond. The battle raged for 10 days. The Molde battalion earned legend with fierce bayonet charges, but Allied defenses ultimately collapsed. By June 1st, Crete had fallen, and around 18,000 troops were evacuated by the Royal Navy, but 12,000 still were left behind, including over 2,100 New Zealanders taken prisoner. Royal Navy ships were hammered by Luftwaffe attacks, 9 sunk and over a dozen damaged. The cost was immense. German paratrooper losses were so high, nearly 4,000 dead, that Hitler banned any future large-scale airborne operations. Churchill called Crete a heavy and far-reaching defeat. For New Zealand, it was a bitter moment. The troops fought with courage, but one critical withdrawal and an over-reliance on flawed assumptions had shifted the course of the campaign. Freyberg's leadership would be questioned for years. Still, the bravery of New Zealand soldiers became a defining chapter in their wartime legacy. Crete was lost, but not without a fight that echoed far beyond the island's rocky hills. The United Kingdom. For over a century, Singapore stood as the jewel of Britain's empire in Asia, a fortress city known as the Gibraltar of the East. With airfields, a major naval base, and a garrison of over 80,000 Allied troops, it was seen as untouchable. In just 7 days, though, it fell. The campaign began on December 8, 1941, when Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya just hours after Pearl Harbor. Under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese advanced over 1,000 kilometers in 55 days, using bicycles, captured trucks, and total air dominance to outmaneuver the British through jungle and rubber plantations. By February 8th, Japanese troops had crossed the Johor Strait and landed on Singapore Island. British defenses were scattered and confused. Though the big coastal guns could rotate inland, they were stocked with armor-piercing shells, useless against infantry. Within days, the Japanese had seized the high ground and cut off water supplies. On February 15th, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered unconditionally. Around 80,000 troops laid down their arms, despite the fact that they outnumbered the Japanese, whose total strength was just 36,000. It was the largest British-led surrender in history. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. For the Empire, it was a moment of shock and shame. Across the world, the image of British soldiers with hands raised went viral. The myth of imperial invincibility cracked. In Australia, Prime Minister John Curtin declared a strategic pivot away from Britain and toward the United States. It marked the birth of a new alliance that still shapes geopolitics today. In the occupied city, horror followed. Thousands of captured Allied troops were sent to forced labor camps. Over 12,000 died building the infamous Burma Railway. For the civilians of Singapore, Japanese military rule meant executions, famine, and constant fear. The fall of Singapore wasn't just a battlefield defeat. It was a psychological and imperial collapse. One island, one surrender, and the illusion of British supremacy in Asia was shattered. France. On May 10th, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of Western Europe. France, confident in its vast army and the fortified Maginot Line, expected another World War I, slow, static, and fought in the trenches. Instead, the Germans did the unthinkable. They sent tanks through the Ardennes forest, a route French generals considered too dense for armor. But it wasn't impassable, it was the perfect weak spot. The German blitzkrieg smashed through at Sedan by May 15. Within days, panzer divisions cut across northern France, encircling Allied forces and racing toward the coast. Over 338,000 British and French troops were rescued at Dunkirk, but the rest of France was left exposed. On June 14th, German troops marched into Paris, declared an open city to spare it from destruction. Just over a week later, on June 22nd, France signed an armistice in the Compiègne forest, inside the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. This time, Hitler stood victorious. France had collapsed in just 46 days. Roughly 1.84 million French soldiers were taken prisoner. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned. Marshal Philippe Pétain took power, and soon after, France was split, a Nazi-occupied north and the collaborationist Vichy regime in the south. Only a handful of leaders, like Charles de Gaulle, fled abroad to continue the fight. The psychological toll was enormous. France had been one of the world's great powers, and now it was humiliated, occupied, and divided. Swastika flags flew from the Eiffel Tower. German troops paraded under the Arc de Triomphe. In Britain, Churchill responded with fury. Fearing that France's navy might fall into German hands, the Royal Navy attacked the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir, killing over 1,000 French sailors. Back in France, the population fled in chaos. Millions displaced in the civilian exodus known as l'Exode. Resistance began, but slowly and under constant threat. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was an existential crisis. The French Republic had failed, and the shame of 1940 would cast a long shadow over French politics, identity, and memory for decades to come. The United States of America. Just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japan struck again, this time at the Philippines, America's largest overseas base. On December 8, 1941, Japanese bombers devastated US airfields, catching aircraft on the ground. Within days, American and Filipino forces were pushed into a desperate retreat. By January 1942, under General Douglas MacArthur, US and Filipino troops pulled back to the Bataan Peninsula, leaving Manila an open city. There, about 76,000 troops, mostly Filipino, with 10,000 Americans, fought under siege for 3 months. Supplies ran out, and malaria, dysentery, and hunger tore through the ranks. On April 9th, Major General Edward King, against MacArthur's orders, surrendered Bataan. It was the largest capitulation in US military history. Then came the Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced march to POW camps. Under the sweltering sun, beaten and denied water, thousands died, including over 600 Americans and as many as 10,000 Filipinos. On May 6th, the last Allied stronghold, Corregidor Island, fell. General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered another 13,000 troops, effectively ending resistance in the Philippines. By mid-May, the islands were fully under Japanese control. The defeat was staggering. The US had lost its most important Pacific outpost. American soldiers, sick, emaciated, abandoned, were paraded through Manila, while MacArthur, having escaped by PT boat, declared from Australia, "I shall return." In the US, Bataan has fallen became a national mourning cry. President Roosevelt praised the defenders' courage, but questions swirled. Why had the planes been caught on the ground? Why were supplies so scarce? Why had these men been left to fight a hopeless battle? In Japan, the victory was celebrated, but the brutality of the death march backfired. Stories of beheadings, beatings, and starvation spread, fueling American outrage. The loss was ultimately both strategic and symbolic. Japan gained control over the Philippines and a launchpad into Southeast Asia, but America's response would be total. In October 1944, MacArthur returned, and by 1945, the Philippines were liberated. Still, Bataan and Corregidor left deep scars. It was America's lowest moment in the Pacific, a defeat that tested its will, shaped its war narrative, and became a symbol of sacrifice and survival. Czechoslovakia. In 1938, Czechoslovakia had one of the best equipped armies in Europe. It boasted over 1,500 modern tanks, state-of-the-art artillery from Skoda, and a massive fortified line guarding its borders. And yet, it never got to fight. The crisis began with Hitler's demand for the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region along the border. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another war, forced Czechoslovakia into accepting the Munich Agreement. On September 30th, without Czech representation, they handed over the Sudetenland to Germany. The loss was catastrophic. The Sudetenland held about 70% of the country's iron and steel industry and nearly all of its fortifications. Czechoslovakia had mobilized nearly 1 million men in late September, prepared to resist. But after Munich, the army stood down without firing a shot. Then came the final blow. On March 14, 1939, Slovakia was carved off and declared a German-aligned puppet state. That night, President Emil Hacha was summoned to Berlin, threatened with the bombing of Prague, and coerced into submission. By dawn on March 15th, German troops were marching into the Czech heartland. No war was declared, no resistance allowed. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was proclaimed. Swastikas replaced Czech flags. It was a conquest without combat, one of the great psychological traumas of the pre-war period. The humiliation was twofold. Czechoslovakia had wanted to fight and might have held off Germany for weeks or longer, but the Western allies wouldn't let it happen. Worse, Germany captured massive stockpiles of Czech weaponry, including tanks that would soon roll through Poland and France. Still, resistance formed underground. In 1942, Czech agents trained by the British assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, the Nazi governor of the Protectorate. The brutal retaliation, the destruction of Lidice, shocked the world and turned Czech defiance into legend. The betrayal of 1938 left deep scars. In Czech political culture, to be sold like Czechoslovakia became shorthand for abandonment. The wound wasn't about military defeat, but about not being allowed to fight for your own country. Nationalist China. In December 1937, Japanese forces captured Nanjing, then the capital of nationalist China. What followed wasn't just a military collapse, it was one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. After months of brutal fighting in Shanghai, the Chinese government withdrew inland, leaving Nanjing defended by roughly 100,000 to 150,000 troops, a mix of regulars and hastily conscripted recruits. They were short on training, weapons, and ammunition. Japanese forces, under General Iwane Matsui, advanced quickly. On December 13th, the city fell. Then, the massacre began. Over the next 6 weeks, between 100,000 and 200,000 civilians and captured Chinese soldiers were killed, shot, bayoneted, burned alive, or buried in mass graves. Tens of thousands of women were raped, many of them mutilated or murdered afterward. Whole districts were looted and destroyed. General Tang Shengji, responsible for defending the city, fled in civilian clothes the night before the fall. It was a total collapse that became a slaughter. A group of Westerners led by John Rabe and Minnie Vautrin established the Nanjing Safety Zone, sheltering an estimated 200,000 civilians. Their efforts saved lives, but their calls for help went unanswered. The world watched in horror but did nothing. For China, Nanjing became a symbol of helplessness and horror. The government had fled, the army disintegrated, and the people were left to face the full brutality of occupation. But it also became a turning point. The massacre galvanized resistance among nationalists, communists, and civilians alike. Hatred of Japan would unite China in a way that politics never had. After the war, General Matsui was convicted and executed by the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. But many others escaped justice. In Japan, debate over the massacre's scale and responsibility still sparks political controversy. In China, the massacre is taught in every school, commemorated in museums, and etched into national memory as proof of what was lost and why it must never happen again. It was a moment of national trauma, one that reshaped China's war, its politics, and its very identity. Poland. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany launched a massive invasion of Poland from the west, north, and through Allied Slovak corridors in the south. It was the opening blow of World War II and the beginning of Poland's darkest chapter. The German Blitzkrieg came fast and brutal. Waves of tanks and dive bombers scattered Polish defenses. Communication lines collapsed. Airfields were destroyed on the ground, and despite heroic stands at Westerplatte and the Battle of the Bajura, Polish forces were quickly overwhelmed. Then came the second blow. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling its secret pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now surrounded, the Polish army had no chance. Stalin called it liberation. For Poland, it was a betrayal from both sides. Warsaw endured nearly a month under siege before agreeing to a ceasefire on September 27th. The next day, the city officially surrendered. The last Polish unit lay down arms at Kotsk on October 6. In just 35 days, Poland was partitioned and erased from the map. Roughly 694,000 troops were taken prisoner, the largest POW total of the 1939 campaigns. And yet, perhaps the deepest wound was diplomatic. Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence, but while they declared war on Germany, they launched no serious offensive. It became known as the Phony War, and Poland was left to fight alone. On September 22nd, German and Soviet troops held a joint victory parade in Brest-Litovsk, smiling beneath swastikas and red stars. It was clear that Poland's fate was sealed. Nazi propaganda ridiculed Poland, claiming cavalry-charged tanks, but the truth was different. Polish troops were brave but outgunned, their strategies outdated. Westerplatte held out for 7 days, becoming a national legend, but a lonely one. The aftermath was also brutal. The Soviets deported over 300,000 civilians from eastern Poland. The Germans executed thousands of intellectuals and community leaders in Intelligenzaktion, setting the stage for the Holocaust. But Poland didn't disappear. A government in exile was formed and underground resistance grew, and from the forests, streets, and exile bases abroad, Poles would continue to fight for their freedom. Finland. In June 1944, Finland suffered its most painful World War II humiliation. The loss of Viipuri, or Vyborg now, and the forced signing of the Moscow Armistice. What made it so devastating was that Finland had fought fiercely to reclaim Viipuri just 3 years earlier, only to lose it again, this time with shocking speed. The war had begun with promise. After losing Karelia in the Winter War, Finland aligned with Germany in 1941 to reclaim lost ground. Viipuri was retaken. Morale soared, but the tide turned quickly. On June 9, 1944, the Soviets launched the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive, hurling thousands of tanks, planes, and artillery at Finnish lines on the Karelian Isthmus. The initial defenses were breached within days. On June 20th, Soviet forces entered Viipuri. Though Finnish troops, including elements of the 20th Infantry Division, briefly fought to defend the city, they were ordered to withdraw. Marshal Mannerheim called the loss a scandal. The Red Army now threatened Helsinki. Though the Soviets were halted at Tali-Ihantala, the cost had been enormous. On September 19th, Finland signed the Moscow Armistice. The terms were harsh: a loss of 11% of national territory, $300 million in reparations, and an agreement to expel German troops, triggering the Lapland War. More than 400,000 Karelians were evacuated again. Viipuri's fall stung. It had been a symbol of defiance after the Winter War. Now, it was lost again, and quickly. Though Finland did keep its independence, it entered the post-war era in a new geopolitical cage, democratic but under constant Soviet scrutiny. Hungary. In January 1943, Hungary endured its greatest military calamity of World War II, the destruction of the Second Army on the Eastern Front. Sent to hold the line along the Don River, it was torn apart in a matter of weeks, leaving behind a scar that still shapes Hungarian memory. At Hitler's urging, Hungary had deployed its Second Army, around 209,000 men, to a remote sector of the front near Stalingrad in 1942. The assignment was sold as routine, but the men arrived with no winter clothing, few anti-tank weapons, and inadequate artillery. When the Soviet Voronezh front launched Operation Ostrogozhsk Rosso on January 12, 1943, the Hungarian line didn't bend, it broke. Temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees Celsius, and Soviet tanks smashed through villages and trenches. Hungarian units, lacking armor or air support, disintegrated in the snow. By February, more than 100,000 troops were dead, wounded, or captured. The survivors, barely 45,000 to 50,000, staggered back west, many frostbitten or psychologically shattered. The Don catastrophe became somewhat of a national trauma. It destroyed Hungary's already fragile military credibility, and even Regent Miklos Horthy later called it one of his greatest regrets. Public confidence in the war effort collapsed. At home, mourning turned into quiet rage. Horthy began exploring ways to distance Hungary from Germany, but Berlin was already watching closely. In 1944, when Horthy finally tried to switch sides, the Nazis occupied Hungary and installed the fascist Arrow Cross regime. Today, the Don campaign is memorialized not for its tactics but for its toll. Over 100,000 Hungarian lives lost in one of the war's most lopsided and brutal offensives. It remains a symbol of loyalty misused and the cost of serving another empire's war. Romania. In November 1942, Romania faced its own Eastern Front nightmare. Assigned to defend the exposed flanks of Germany's 6th Army during the Battle of Stalingrad, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies collapsed under the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, turning Hitler's biggest gamble into a full-scale disaster. Romania had joined the invasion of the USSR in 1941, seeking to reclaim Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. But by late 1942, that war of recovery had morphed into a war of survival. 231,000 Romanian troops manned long, thin sectors north and south of Stalingrad, short on anti-tank weapons and defensive depth. On November 19th, the Red Army struck the Third Army near the Don. On November 20th, they hit the 4th near the Kalmyk Steppe. It was over in days. Soviet armor tore through Romanian lines, scattering infantry who had only rifles and grenades. German reinforcements never arrived. By November 23rd, the Soviet pincers met at Kalak, completing the encirclement of the German 6th Army. In just 2 weeks, Romania lost 159,000 men, including over 92,000 captured. Divisions vanished, and survivors described chaos, abandonment, and bitter cold. While German commanders blamed the Romanians, but the reality was grim. Romania had been given impossible terrain, insufficient tools, and no real backup. In Bucharest, Marshal Ion Antonescu saw his prestige crumble. The myth of Romania's brotherhood of arms with Germany lay buried beneath Stalingrad's snow. The public, grieving and disillusioned, began to see the war for what it was, a foreign crusade that had consumed Romanian lives for German gain. Quiet diplomacy began soon after, but the damage was done. When Romania finally broke from the Axis in August 1944, the memory of Stalingrad loomed large. The Netherlands. On May 10, 1940, the Netherlands awoke to war. Despite its neutrality, it had become a key target in Hitler's blitzkrieg across Western Europe. German troops, backed by paratroopers and bombers, struck from multiple directions. The Battle of the Netherlands lasted only 5 days. Within hours, German airborne units had seized bridges and airfields around Rotterdam and The Hague, including Moerdijk, Valkenburg, and Ypenburg. The Dutch army, though mobilized and numbering around 280,000 troops, was poorly equipped. Only a few dozen armored cars, no tanks, and many units still reliant on horse transport. Still, they fought. The fiercest resistance came at the Grebbe line, where Dutch troops held off the German advance for days, but the odds were impossible. The breaking point came on May 14th, when the Luftwaffe bombed Rotterdam. Nearly 900 civilians were killed, 80,000 left homeless, and the city centre reduced to rubble. German commanders then threatened to bomb Utrecht next. Faced with the prospect of more civilian massacres, the Dutch High Command surrendered on May 15th. The government and Queen Wilhelmina had already fled to London on May 13th, vowing to resist in exile. Only Zeeland continued fighting briefly with French support until May 17th. The capitulation was painful. Some Dutch units still had the will to fight, but surrender was chosen to spare more cities from destruction. General Henry Winkelmann, who signed the capitulation, made that clear. Yet, the images of swastikas over Amsterdam and The Hague haunted the nation. From exile, Queen Wilhelmina's radio broadcasts urged resistance. At home, the occupation sparked one of Europe's most resilient underground movements, spanning sabotage, intelligence gathering, and press networks. More than 100,000 Dutch Jews were deported and murdered, a staggering toll from a population of 140,000. The Nazi regime repurposed Dutch infrastructure for its war machine, while collaborators, like the NSB, were despised. After the war, the trauma of 1940 forced the Dutch to rethink everything. Neutrality was dead. The Netherlands joined NATO, helped build the European Union, and never again intended to face invasion alone. Belgium. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium, shattering its neutrality for the second time in a generation. The Belgian army, around 650,000 strong, mobilized alongside British and French forces. They fought fiercely at the Albert Canal, at Fort Ibn Emael, and in battles across Flanders. But within 18 days, it was over. The collapse began with a devastating psychological blow. German glider troops captured the invincible Fort Ibn Emael in less than a day using hollow charge explosives. Belgian resistance at first was determined, but the real disaster came when German tanks broke through the Ardennes, outflanking the Allies and cutting their escape routes to the sea. With British and French forces racing to Dunkirk, Belgium became increasingly isolated. On May 28th, King Leopold III made the fateful decision to surrender unconditionally without consulting his cabinet, which had fled to France on May 25th. The king believed surrender would spare Belgian civilians further suffering, but the consequences were enormous. Roughly 500,000 Belgian soldiers were taken prisoner, the majority of whom were later repatriated, though officers remained in German camps. The diplomatic fallout was also immediate. French Premier Paul Reynaud condemned it as an event without precedent in history. Churchill was also furious. The surrender endangered the Allied flank at Dunkirk and fueled bitter recriminations. Within Belgium, Leopold's act divided the nation. Some saw it as a humanitarian decision, others viewed it as cowardice, or worse, collaboration. The Belgian government in exile declared that it, not Leopold, represented legitimate Belgian sovereignty. Leopold remained under house arrest for the rest of the war. After liberation, the royal question dominated Belgian politics. Could a monarch who had surrendered unilaterally resume the throne? Public opinion said no. In 1951, Leopold abdicated in favor of his son, Baudouin. In the end, the defeat was swift and painful. The fall of Fort Ibn Email symbolized Belgium's lack of preparedness. Despite brave stands at places like the Lys River, Belgium's fate was sealed by isolation, lack of coordination, and the overwhelming force of the German Blitzkrieg. Under German occupation, Belgium suffered mass deportations, forced labor, and collaborationist rule, notably from the Rexist party. Yet, resistance grew steadily. Belgian agents and guerrilla fighters provided critical intelligence and sabotage, while Belgian units fought alongside the Allies in North Africa and Italy. Belgium's collapse in 1940 wasn't due to a lack of courage, but to strategic isolation, political division, and the brutal realities of modern mechanized warfare. Recovery came slowly, but dignity was ultimately reclaimed through resistance, sacrifice, and rebuilding. Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia's defeat in April 1941 was fast, total, and humiliating, one of the most complete collapses of any state in World War II. What began as diplomatic maneuvering ended in blitzkrieg, betrayal, and occupation within just 11 days. On March 25, 1941, the Yugoslav government, under pressure from Berlin, signed the Tripartite Pact, joining the Axis. But just 2 days later, a British-backed military coup overthrew the regime, enraging Hitler. His response was immediate. Operation 25, a full-scale invasion by Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The attack began on April 6 with Luftwaffe bombers pounding Belgrade. Initial reports claimed up to 17,000 civilians killed, but modern estimates put the death toll between 2,000 and 4,000. German tanks surged from Austria and Bulgaria, Italians invaded from the west, and Hungarians from the north. On paper, the Yugoslav army had over 700,000 men, but the kingdom was deeply divided. Ethnic Croat and Slovene units surrendered or deserted, and the command structure rapidly disintegrated. Resistance crumbled. By April 17th, Yugoslavia surrendered unconditionally. Around 344,000 Yugoslav soldiers were taken prisoner, with 254,000 falling into German hands alone. German losses? Just 151 dead, 392 wounded, and 15 missing. The Axis dismembered the country. Germany, Italy, and Hungary seized territory, and the fascist independent state of Croatia was proclaimed. The king and government fled to London, and Yugoslavia ceased to exist. For a nation that had fought fiercely in World War I, the collapse was a national disaster. Poor coordination, deep ethnic fractures, and an overwhelming enemy force left the country defenseless. The Belgrade bombing stunned the public. The swiftness of defeat was a shock. But out of that wreckage came resistance. By summer 1941, two major guerrilla forces had formed, the royalist Chetniks and the communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito. The partisans would go on to become one of the most successful resistance movements in Europe. The collapse planted the seeds of post-war ethnic tensions. Tito's communist regime rebuilt Yugoslavia and promoted the myth of unified resistance, but beneath that narrative, the memory of 1941 festered. The divisions that helped destroy the kingdom would echo through the Balkans for decades. Norway. On April 9th, 1940, Norway faced the full weight of Germany's Blitzkrieg as part of Operation Weserübung. Within 62 days, the country was occupied, its government in exile, and its name linked forever to the word traitor. Germany's goal was strategic: secure ports, safeguard iron ore shipments from Sweden, and block British intervention. The invasion began with simultaneous landings and air assaults on key cities like Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. The Norwegian army, under-equipped and unprepared, scrambled to mobilize. A few high points did stand out. At Oscarsborg Fortress, for example, aging coastal guns sank the German heavy cruiser Blücher, delaying the capture of Oslo and allowing the royal family and government to flee north. Allied forces attempted to assist, most notably at Narvik, where Allied troops briefly recaptured the town on May 28th, only to evacuate again on June 8th under German pressure. Despite scattered resistance in northern garrisons, organized Norwegian defense formally ended on June 10th when the military capitulation went into effect. Then came the most symbolic blow. Vidkun Quisling, a fringe fascist politician, proclaimed himself leader in a radio address on April 9th. But his self-declared government lasted only 6 days before the Germans installed a military administration. It wasn't until February 1942 that Quisling was officially made minister-president of a German-backed puppet regime. Norwegians were stunned. A nation that had stayed neutral in World War I was now occupied, and a collaborator had attempted a power grab in its capital. While some Norwegians continued to fight abroad, including the Merchant Navy and Free Norwegian Forces, resistance at home grew steadily. Underground networks formed, sabotage operations increased, and the exiled King Håkon VII became a powerful symbol of defiance. Still, the defeat stung. Norway's failure to mobilize in time, the speed of Germany's advance, and the quick fall of major cities festered a deep sense of national shame. Nazi propaganda painted the invasion as protection, but few believed it. After the war, Norway abandoned neutrality and joined NATO in 1949, determined never to be caught off guard again. Quisling was tried and executed in 1945. His name remains a global synonym for betrayal, marking Norway's 1940 defeat not just as a military failure, but as a profound moral wound. Bulgaria. In the summer of 1944, as the Soviet army advanced through Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, an Axis ally since 1941, found itself cornered. The result wasn't a battle, but something arguably more humiliating: a regime collapse without firing a shot. Bulgaria had declared war on the UK and US, but carefully avoided conflict with the Soviet Union. Still, by September 1944, with Germany crumbling and Red Army forces on the doorstep, Sofia scrambled to change course. The government purged pro-German figures and declared neutrality, but it was too late. On September 5th, the Soviet Union declared war. By September 8th, Soviet troops crossed the Danube and entered Bulgarian territory. The Bulgarian army, under explicit orders from the Regency Council not to resist, stood down. On September 9th, the Fatherland Front, a communist-led coalition supported by pro-Allied officers and buoyed by Soviet proximity, staged a bloodless coup in Sofia. The Red Army didn't fire in the capital, but its presence ensured the transition. The monarchy, already sidelined, was rendered irrelevant. Tsar Simeon II, a child at the time, became a powerless figurehead. In September 1946, a national referendum abolished the monarchy, and Simeon was exiled. For Bulgaria, the humiliation was multi-layered. Its military, one of the country's oldest and most venerated institutions, had marched proudly into Macedonia and parts of eastern Yugoslavia during the war. But now, it stood idle as foreign tanks rolled through the capital. There was no last stand, just quiet submission. The new Fatherland Front government declared war on Germany, and Bulgarian troops later fought in Yugoslavia and Hungary alongside the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front. But this wasn't redemption, it was realignment under Soviet supervision. The ultimate cost was measured in sovereignty. Bulgaria was spared the destruction that hit Warsaw or Budapest, but its political system was overhauled. Though Soviet troops officially withdrew in 1947 under the Paris Peace Treaty, Moscow's grip remained unshaken through the Bulgarian Communist Party. To some, the Soviet entry was liberation from fascism. To others, it was the moment Bulgaria lost its independence. The debate endures. Bulgaria in World War II is often remembered as the country that switched sides, but how it happened, without a fight, without warning, and entirely under foreign control, is a reminder that some of history's most humiliating defeats come not through battle, but through silence. Slovakia. In 1944, the Slovak Republic, a Nazi-aligned puppet state under Jozef Tiso, tried to redeem itself. The result was the Slovak National Uprising, a bold but ultimately doomed attempt to break away from fascist rule and join the Allies. It ended in crushing defeat, public executions, and one of the bloodiest chapters in Slovak history. Launched on August 29, 1944, the uprising was led by Slovak army officers and partisans aiming to overthrow the Tiso regime and aid the approaching Soviet Red Army. Though only around 18,000 regular troops managed to rally at the start, total insurgent strength eventually reached 60,000 to 80,000, including resistance fighters and Red Army advisors. The rebellion managed to seize large parts of central Slovakia, and the town of Banská Bystrica became the rebel capital. But things unraveled quickly. Soviet offensives stalled at the Dukla Pass, delaying reinforcements and supplies. German forces, including SS and anti-partisan units like the notorious Derlavanger Brigade, were rushed in. On October 27th, the Germans crushed the rebellion and retook Banská Bystrica. 3 days later, President Tiso marked the victory with a public Te Deum in the city's cathedral, celebrating the restoration of order over Slovak territory. It was a grim symbol of just how thoroughly the uprising had failed. Many Slovak units were disarmed before they could even join the fight. The rebellion's leaders, Generals Jan Golian and Rudolf Viest, were captured shortly after and later executed, likely at Flossenburg concentration camp in early 1945. German reprisals were horrific. Entire villages were razed, with an estimated 12,000 civilians and partisans killed and over 10,000 others captured or deported. The Tiso regime limped on until March 1945, when the Red Army took Slovakia. Ironically, though the uprising failed on the battlefield, it helped rehabilitate Slovakia's international standing. It strengthened the position of the Czechoslovak government in exile, allowing it to present the country as a co-belligerent rather than a defeated Axis power. Still, Slovakia was reabsorbed into a unitary Czechoslovakia, and full equality would only come later. Today, the Slovak national uprising is remembered less as a failure and more as a moral turning point. A last, desperate attempt to sever ties with Germany. Its military defeat was undeniable, but its legacy gave post-war Slovakia something invaluable: a claim to resistance and a role in Europe's liberation. Australia. Australia's worst military defeat of World War II came not on its own shores but in Singapore. A catastrophe shared with Britain but felt with unique intensity in Australia. In February 1942, the fall of this impregnable fortress marked not just a collapse in Allied defences, but a national reckoning for Australians who had placed their trust in the British Empire. Roughly 15,000 Australian soldiers, part of the 8th Division, had fought hard during Japan's invasion of Malaya. As Japanese forces advanced rapidly through the jungles, faster than anyone had predicted, British Empire troops were forced back to the island of Singapore. On February 15th, British General Arthur Percival surrendered unconditionally to Japan's General Yamashita. About 85,000 troops, including 15,000 Australians, became prisoners, the largest mass surrender in British and Australian military history. The humiliation for Australia was enormous. Soldiers were left to rot in Japanese prison camps, forced to work on the Thai-Burma Railway and endure brutal treatment. Thousands never returned. The 8th Division had fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered, undersupplied, and caught in a poorly led defense. Australia had trusted Britain to defend the Pacific and was left abandoned. Just 4 days after the surrender, Japanese bombs fell on Darwin, bringing the war directly to Australia's doorstep. But the political shift had already started. Back in late December, Prime Minister John Curtin had warned that Australia could no longer rely solely on Britain. Without inhibitions or pangs, he said, we look to America. It was a turning point. not just in strategy but in identity. The old trust in Britain was gone, and the US would become Australia's new security partner for the next 80 years. Militarily, the shock of Singapore forced Australia to regroup. Australian forces went on to fight in New Guinea, Borneo, and the broader Pacific theatre, helping to turn the tide against Japan. But the scars of Singapore remained. It was the moment Australia realised it was alone and vulnerable. The British may have called Singapore their Gibraltar of the East, but for Australians it was Gallipoli in reverse, a courageous stand sacrificed by bad leadership ending in defeat and captivity. Canada. For Canada, the bloodiest and most humiliating day of World War II came on August 19, 1942, at the French port of Dieppe. Codenamed Operation Jubilee, the raid was intended as a test run for a future Allied invasion. It turned into a nightmare. Of the 6,100 troops who landed that morning, nearly 5,000 were Canadian, eager to prove themselves in battle after years of training in Britain. But the raid was doomed from the start. Poor intelligence, inadequate planning, and overconfidence led to catastrophe. The beaches were heavily fortified, overlooked by cliffs, and backed by machine gun nests and artillery. German defenders were ready and waiting. Tanks bogged down in the pebbly beach, infantry were cut down before reaching the seawall, and by early afternoon, the order was given to retreat. The results? 916 Canadians killed in action, 505 wounded, and 1,946 taken prisoner, fully 2/3 of those who went ashore, all in less than 10 hours. The raid failed to achieve any of its objectives. No major infrastructure was destroyed. Radar sites remained intact. The cost was catastrophic. German propaganda gloated and Canadian morale plunged. For the families back home, it was a gut punch. This had been Canada's big chance to show its strength on European soil, and it ended with mass casualties and prisoners. Historians later labelled Dieppe as a colossal blunder. Troops were sent into a frontal assault in broad daylight with minimal air or naval support. Even Churchill later called it a forlorn enterprise. But Dieppe wasn't entirely in vain. The raid forced the Allies to rethink amphibious operations. Lessons learned about timing, surprise, and coordination would prove crucial in Normandy 2 years later. Some veterans of Dieppe returned for D-Day, this time on Juno Beach, where Canadian forces helped break through. Still, Dieppe never stopped stinging. It became part of Canada's national war memory, a tragedy of bravery and bungled leadership. To this day, August 19th is commemorated as a day of remembrance. Canada eventually earned battlefield glory, but at Dieppe, it paid the price for Allied miscalculation with blood. The USSR. The Soviet Union's most devastating early defeat in World War II came not at Moscow or Stalingrad, but earlier, in September 1941, during the Battle of Kiev. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it became the largest encirclement in military history and a brutal indictment of Stalin's leadership. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Army Group South advanced rapidly toward Kiev. Despite repeated warnings from his generals to withdraw, Stalin ordered the city held at all costs. That refusal sealed the fate of the entire Soviet Southwestern Front. From late August to September 26, German forces executed a massive pincer movement. The pocket was sealed on September 16th, and the city itself fell on the 19th, with organized Soviet resistance collapsing by the 26th. Between 452,000 and 460,000 Red Army troops were trapped. General Mikhail Kerpenos was killed trying to break out. German bulletins claimed 665,000 Soviet prisoners, though modern historians estimate the real number was closer to 460,000. The Soviets also lost nearly 411 tanks and 28,000 artillery pieces, a staggering blow to one of their most experienced fronts. The scale shocked even German commanders. By sheer numbers, it was one of the Wehrmacht's most overwhelming victories. Some officers called it the greatest battle in military history. The humiliation for the Soviets was total. Stalin's rigid command had turned a retreat delay into annihilation. Soviet doctrine proved inflexible. communications broke down, and German propaganda paraded endless columns of POWs through the streets. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin was shaken. He purged senior commanders, but also began delegating more tactical authority, slowly shifting Red Army strategy towards survivability and flexibility. In Ukraine, the reaction was complicated. Some civilians initially welcomed the Germans, hoping for relief from Stalinist repression, but that illusion ended swiftly. The victory gave the Germans control over eastern Ukraine, but it also delayed their drive on Moscow, forcing panzer units to pivot south for weeks. That pause, historians argue, cost Hitler precious time before Operation Typhoon. In the end, Kiev was a disaster born of inflexibility and arrogance. Stalin, brutally, learned from it. Hitler didn't, and that would change the trajectory of the war. Philippines. When Japan invaded the Philippines in December 1941, the islands became the stage for one of the most harrowing campaigns of World War II and one of the most painful betrayals in Filipino memory. US General Douglas MacArthur commanded the combined American and Filipino forces under USA FFE, facing overwhelming odds. After a failed defense in Luzon, the surviving Allied troops, about 76,000 in total, including 66,000 Filipino and 10,000 American soldiers, fell back to the Bataan Peninsula. There, they endured 3 brutal months of siege, starvation, and disease, holding out with dwindling supplies and no reinforcements. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King surrendered Bataan against MacArthur's orders. A month later, Corregidor Island fell on May 6, bringing the total number of Allied prisoners to nearly 88,000, the vast majority of them Filipino. Then came the Bataan Death March, a forced 65-mile trek in sweltering heat with little food or water. Thousands died, up to 10,000 Filipinos and 650 Americans, from exhaustion, beatings, or execution. Survivors were packed into prison camps where many would later perish from disease and neglect. Filipino soldiers had fought under the US flag, with promises of fair pay, protection, and eventual independence under the Tydings-McDuffie Act. They were also promised veterans benefits, but not US citizenship, despite fighting alongside American troops. Many felt abandoned when MacArthur evacuated Corregidor on March 12th, leaving his men behind under orders from Washington. But the fight wasn't over. A vast guerrilla movement emerged across the islands, including more than 250,000 Filipinos by the war's end. These underground fighters harassed Japanese forces, gathered intelligence, and kept the spirit of resistance alive. The Japanese occupation was vicious. Civilians endured executions, mass arrests, torture, and famine. Yet, through the darkness, hope endured. The Philippines was liberated in 1945, and on July 4th, 1946, it gained full independence from the United States. To this day, April 9th is commemorated as the Day of Valor, honoring the bravery and suffering of those who stood, marched, and died on Bataan. It remains a symbol not just of defeat, but of unbreakable spirit. South Africa. South Africa's greatest military humiliation in World War II came in June of 1942, when its 2nd Infantry Division was encircled and surrendered at Tobruk, Libya. The fall of Tobruk, once a symbol of Allied defiance, became a stain on South African military history. Tobruk had previously held out heroically in 1941, but in 1942 it was underprepared. Major General Hendrik Klopper, commanding the Tobruk garrison of about 33,000 troops, including approximately 10,772 South Africans, had assumed the fortress could withstand a siege. He was wrong. On June 20th, a German general, Erwin Rommel, launched a rapid assault. South African and British positions were quickly overrun. Defensive lines had been weakened, minefields poorly placed, and air support lacking. Within 24 hours, German tanks rolled into Tobruk. Klopper, facing chaos and communications breakdowns, surrendered on June 21st. Around 33,000 Allied troops were captured, including about 10,772 South Africans. It was the 2nd largest surrender of British-led forces after Singapore. For South Africa, the entire 2nd Division was effectively lost in a single day. The humiliation was profound. Photos and footage of captured South African troops were circulated in Nazi propaganda reels. In Cape Town, the surrender triggered national shock and political backlash. Prime Minister Jan Smuts, a key Allied figure, faced growing criticism for exposing South African troops to defeat under British command. Winston Churchill later said it was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. In South Africa, the loss was widely mourned as a national nadir. Strategically, the fall of Tobruk opened the road to Egypt and forced a major Allied reshuffle. It accelerated the need for US tank reinforcements and contributed to a full reorganization of the 8th Army. South African forces were never again deployed independently. They served as part of larger Allied units in North Africa and Italy. Meanwhile, thousands of captured South African soldiers endured years in German and Italian POW camps. But South Africa wasn't broken. Its remaining troops fought bravely at El Alamein later that year and earned distinction in Italy with the 6th Armoured Division. Still, Tobruk remained a national scar, a reminder of overconfidence, weak preparation, and the brutal price of war. India, as the crown jewel of the British Empire, fielded one of the largest volunteer armies in World War II. But its most painful defeats came in Malaya and Singapore in 1941-42, where Indian troops made up nearly half of the Allied forces. Out of roughly 90,000 British Empire troops in the Malayan campaign and the defense of Singapore, around 55,000 were Indian soldiers, mostly from the 9th and 11th Divisions. After a rapid Japanese advance through Malaya, the Allied remnants fell back to Singapore. After a brief defense, British Commander General Arthur Percival surrendered on February 15th, and about 55,000 Indian troops became prisoners, the largest single capture of Indian soldiers in history. Japanese forces separated the Indian POWs and began recruiting for the Indian National Army, a pro-Axis force led later by Subhas Chandra Bose. Roughly 30,000 Indian soldiers defected, choosing to fight for Indian independence alongside Japan. For the British Empire, this was a shattering blow, because the defeat at Singapore wasn't just about military failure, it eroded the legitimacy of British rule in Indian eyes. Gandhi, Nehru, and other leaders seized on the moment, arguing that if the British couldn't defend Singapore, how could they claim to govern India? The Quit India movement, launched later that year, drew strength from this very collapse. In the war's later years, Indian forces proved themselves, particularly in the Burma campaign, where they helped defeat Japan at Imphal and Kohima. But the sting of Singapore lingered. The fall of 55,000 soldiers and the defection of 30,000 more marked a turning point. The military humiliation became political fuel for India's final push for freedom. Thailand. Thailand's most humiliating World War II moment came on December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces invaded by land and sea, seeking passage to Malaya and Burma. Despite recent military success against French Indochina, Thailand was quickly overwhelmed by Japan's precision. The fighting lasted only a few hours. Thai troops resisted at key points, Prakchap Kirikan and Songkhla, but faced a superior force. Japan had prepared well. Airfields were targeted and troops quickly seized control of transportation hubs. By midday, Prime Minister Pibun Songkhram ordered a ceasefire. Within 24 hours, Thailand granted Japan basing rights, and by December 21st, the two countries had signed a military alliance. Thailand even declared a war on the Allies, though its ambassador in Washington refused to deliver the declaration. While this spared Thailand from occupation, it came at a cost. A nation proud of its independence, never colonized, was now effectively a Japanese puppet. Though Pibun framed the alliance as pragmatic, many Thais saw it as capitulation in disguise. The army's rapid collapse and the speed with which political leaders aligned with Tokyo was deeply embarrassing. Despite the alliance, internal dissent simmered. The Free Thai movement, led by exiles like Pridi Banomyong, cooperated with Allied intelligence. But domestically, Thailand had to toe Japan's line. Thai troops occupied parts of British Burma and Malaya on Tokyo's behalf, further complicating the post-war reckoning. Strategically, Pibun's decision was a gamble. He hoped Thailand could leverage Japan's rise for regional gain. Instead, the war turned, and by 1944, the alliance was a liability. Pibon was removed, and Thailand quietly began distancing itself from Japan. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Thailand quickly repudiated its wartime alliance and narrowly avoided being treated as a defeated Axis power. In Thai memory, December 8, 1941 represents a moment of conflicted national pride. Brief resistance followed by political surrender. Though the Free Thai resistance and post-war diplomacy salvaged the country's standing, the initial collapse revealed how quickly a powerful nation could be forced to bend when caught unprepared. Denmark. Denmark holds the unfortunate distinction of suffering one of World War II's quickest defeats. On April 9, 1940, Germany invaded as part of Operation Weserübung, launching a blitz against Denmark and Norway. The attack began at dawn. By 10 a.m., Denmark had capitulated. German troops crossed the border at Schleswig and landed paratroopers at key locations, including Copenhagen, seizing airfields and transportation lines. Despite minor resistance at places like Lundtoftbjerg and the Amalienborg Palace, Danish forces were completely outmatched. The Luftwaffe threatened to bomb Copenhagen if Denmark resisted. At 8:34 a.m., the Danish government and King Christian X agreed to surrender, and Denmark was placed under German occupation. In total, the fighting had lasted under 6 hours. The humiliation was stark. Denmark, hoping to remain neutral, had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany just the year before. Its military was small and underfunded. Still, many Danes had hoped for more than a token resistance. Only 16 Danish soldiers were killed with 20 wounded, and most units never had time to mobilize. Some locals later mocked the event as the 6-hour war. While Denmark was spared the destruction faced by Poland or France, its quick surrender became a source of national shame. Internationally, it looked like Denmark had folded without a fight. German propaganda pointed to Denmark as proof of resistance being futile. Domestically, the situation was complex. The Danish government remained in place for several years, negotiating autonomy under German occupation. But this model occupation brought its own tension. Some saw the cooperation as pragmatic, while others viewed it as appeasement. Resistance grew steadily, culminating in acts of sabotage, strikes, and notably the rescue of Danish Jews in 1943, a remarkable humanitarian effort. In hindsight, Denmark's leadership likely saved thousands of lives by avoiding urban warfare. Still, the memory of April 9, 1940 lives on as a painful reminder of vulnerability. The 6-hour collapse remains one of the most abrupt and one-sided campaigns in modern military history. Luxembourg. On May 10, 1940, as German tanks rolled westward in their blitzkrieg against France, the tiny Grand Duchy of Luxembourg disappeared from the map, virtually overnight. With a defense force of just 671 men, a mix of border guards, gendarmes, and a small volunteer corps, Luxembourg had clung to its traditional policy of neutrality as it had in World War I. But this time, neutrality meant nothing. At dawn, German troops crossed the border, and by mid-morning, the capital and most of the country were under German control. What little resistance Luxembourg could offer came in the form of brief border skirmishes along the Schuster line, where police exchanged fire with disguised German saboteurs posing as civilians. German commandos attempted, unsuccessfully, to sever Luxembourg's radio broadcasts. But these isolated efforts were symbolic at best, and there was no functioning army, no air force, and no realistic chance of defense. The royal family and government fled early that morning, establishing a government in exile in London. Rather than immediate annexation, Luxembourg was placed under German military administration. It wasn't until August 1942 that the territory was officially absorbed into the Reich under Gauleiter Gustav Simon. The Luxembourg sovereignty had vanished. German troops began policing city streets and installations the same day, a surreal image of how quickly daily life had been commandeered. What followed was even more damaging. Luxembourgish identity itself was systematically targeted. By late 1940, the use of French and Luxembourgish was suppressed. National institutions were dismantled, and in 1942, young men were forcibly conscripted into the German army. The occupation wasn't just military, it was cultural erasure. Despite its size, Luxembourg's occupation had broader consequences. Its well-maintained road network became a vital corridor for German armor slicing through the Ardennes into Belgium and northern France. While Luxembourg couldn't have stopped the Blitzkrieg, its swift collapse gave Germany a clear and immediate advantage in maneuver warfare. Germany. In February 1943, Germany suffered its most crushing defeat of the war with the surrender of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. What began as a bold summer offensive in 1942, aimed at seizing Soviet oil fields and the symbolic city bearing Stalin's name, turned into a frozen death trap that shattered the myth of German invincibility. The operation had Hitler's personal stamp all over it. Taking Stalingrad wasn't just about strategy, it was about pride. But pride, as it turned out, came at the cost of over 500,000 Axis casualties. Fighting began in earnest in August 1942. German troops under General Friedrich Paulus battled street by street in brutal urban warfare, facing dug-in Soviet defenders who refused to yield. By November, the Germans controlled most of the city. Then came the trap. On November 19th, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, an encircling offensive that slammed into the exposed flanks of the German position, manned mostly by under-equipped Romanian and Hungarian troops. Within days, the entire 6th Army was surrounded. Hitler refused to retreat. Stalingrad will be held at all costs, he ordered, promising air resupply that was ultimately insufficient. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal. No German officer of that rank had ever surrendered, and the message was clear. But on February 2nd, 1943, starving, frozen, and out of ammunition, Paulus did just that. He surrendered 91,000 surviving troops, including over 20 generals. Only a fraction, around 5,000, would survive Soviet captivity. For Nazi Germany, the loss was staggering. The 6th Army had been one of its most elite formations. Its destruction marked the end of Germany's eastward push and the beginning of an unrelenting Soviet counteroffensive that wouldn't stop until Berlin. On the home front, the news triggered national shock. Goebbels' infamous Total War speech on February 18th tried to rally the public, but the defeat at Stalingrad lingered like a funeral bell over the Reich. While Hitler never publicly called it the turning point of the war, that's how historians and Allied leaders would remember it. Stalingrad marked the moment Germany went from conqueror to desperate defender. After Stalingrad, the only direction the German army marched was backwards. Brazil. Brazil's entry into World War II was historic. It became the only South American nation to send ground troops to the European front. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, numbering around 25,900, joined the Allied campaign in Italy in mid-1944. After months of training and cautious advances, Brazilian troops scored their first victories in the mountainous terrain of northern Tuscany. But in late December, just after Christmas, Brazil faced its greatest wartime setback, the Battle of Garfagnana. On December 26, 1944, Axis forces, composed of German troops and Italian fascist holdouts, launched a surprise counterattack in the Serchio Valley. Their goal was to disrupt Allied operations and regain lost territory. The assault fell primarily on the US 92nd Infantry Division, but Brazilian detachments from the 6th Regimental Combat Team, stationed nearby, had to respond quickly. The attack recaptured the town of Barga, which Brazilian troops had proudly helped liberate only weeks earlier. The offensive sent shockwaves through the Allied command. Although the Axis force was relatively small, it achieved complete tactical surprise. Poor weather, limited intelligence, and holiday leave schedules contributed to the Allied unpreparedness. Brazilian troops, still gaining combat experience, were forced to pull back alongside US units. Though the front was stabilized within days, Barga was not recaptured until January 2nd, 1945, after a determined counteroffensive. For Brazil, the setback was deeply symbolic. The BEF's motto, "A cobra vai fumar," the snake will smoke, had become a rallying cry to prove skeptics wrong. Losing ground, even temporarily, threatened that hard-earned momentum. Brazilian forces had been eager to demonstrate their valor on the international stage, and the idea of losing a town they had once helped take stung deeply. Still, the Brazilian troops rebounded quickly. While the January 2nd counterattack was led by US forces, Brazilian soldiers participated in subsequent operations and saw their combat performance improve in the months ahead. In early 1945, they achieved major successes at Monte Castello and Montese, helping crack the German Gothic line. But within the Brazilian military, Garfagnana remained a sobering lesson about the chaos of war and a reminder that even the most distant participants in World War II were not immune from its harshest realities. Iran. In August 1941, Iran, then known as Persia, found itself forcibly pulled into World War II despite its declared neutrality. Its strategic location, oil reserves, and control over the vital Trans-Iranian Railway made it a primary target for the Allies, who feared increasing German influence under Reza Shah Pahlavi. On August 25th, British and Soviet forces launched a surprise, coordinated invasion from the south and north. The British advanced from Iraq and the Persian Gulf, while the Soviets moved in from the Caucasus. Within days, key cities including Abadan, Tabriz, and Kermanshah had fallen. Iran's military, ill-equipped and poorly coordinated, was no match. By September 17th, British and Soviet forces had entered Tehran. Reza Shah, under intense pressure and facing occupation of his capital, ordered surrender on the 16th and agreed to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was subsequently sent into exile, dying 3 years later in South Africa. The Allies secured control of the railway and oil infrastructure, establishing the Persian Corridor as a major supply route to the Soviet Union for the remainder of the war. The occupation, though relatively light, was a searing blow to Iranian sovereignty. British and Soviet troops remained in the country until 1946, and the division of Iran into separate zones of control stoked deep resentment. Although Iran wasn't formally annexed or colonized, the optics were clear. A sovereign nation had been militarily coerced into compliance by two world powers. For many Iranians, the episode reinforced long-standing suspicions of foreign intervention. Reza Shah's fall was seen not just as a personal failure, but as the collapse of a broader national project aimed at independence, modernization, and self-sufficiency. Though his rule had been autocratic, his removal by foreign troops marked a traumatic moment. Tehran became a garrison city under Allied watch, and Iran's declared neutrality was rendered meaningless. Despite its subjugation, Iran's post-war alignment with the Allies allowed it a seat at the 1945 founding conference of the United Nations. But the 1941 invasion left lasting scars. It foreshadowed Cold War tensions, particularly in northern Iran, where the Soviets supported separatist movements, and planted the seeds of Iranian nationalism that would re-emerge with force in the decades to follow. The toppling of the Shah was a harsh reminder of how quickly sovereignty could be stripped away under the weight of great power politics. Iraq. In April 1941, the Kingdom of Iraq briefly attempted to pivot away from British influence, only to be pulled violently back into the fold. A nationalist coup led by Prime Minister Rashid Ali Al-Ghalani, with support from pro-Axis officers known as the Golden Square, overthrew the pro-British government and installed a regime that sought closer ties to Germany. For Britain, already fighting in North Africa and deeply reliant on Middle Eastern oil and air bases, the move posed a major threat. On May the 2nd, Iraqi forces loyal to the new regime laid siege to the British airbase at Albania. Despite being a training facility with limited combat forces, the Royal Air Force launched a bold counterattack. Using converted training planes and aging bombers, the RAF bombed Iraqi artillery positions and quickly broke the siege. Reinforcements from India and Transjordan crossed into Iraq, moving toward Baghdad with little resistance. By the end of May, British troops entered the capital largely unopposed. Rashid Ali fled into exile, and the Hashemite regent, Prince Abdullah, was restored. In less than 4 weeks, the coup had collapsed. While Iraq formally remained independent, British troops reoccupied strategic points, and the country was forced to reaffirm its allegiance to the Allied cause. The failed coup was a humiliating blow for Arab nationalists. It exposed the weakness of Iraq's military and the fragility of its political institutions. The promise of pan-Arab unity and independence from colonial powers, championed by Rashid Ali and his German backers, evaporated in days. British dominance in Iraq was reasserted with striking ease. The aftermath also turned bloody. In June 1941, anti-Jewish riots erupted in Baghdad in a violent episode known as the Farhud. While not directly orchestrated by the coup plotters, the chaos and power vacuum contributed to the violence. Though the British victory restored their position, it also planted the seeds of deeper resentment. The brief moment of nationalist defiance, crushed so quickly, became a rallying point for future Arab movements. Rashid Ali remained in exile, but his vision of an Arab world free from Western domination lingered on, echoed later by figures like Nasser and the Baathists. The Anglo-Iraqi War was short, but its legacy outlived the conflict. Japan. In June 1942, Imperial Japan's streak of conquests came to a screeching halt at the Battle of Midway, an encounter that would go down as one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Fresh from victories across the Pacific, Japan planned to lure and destroy the US Pacific Fleet in a carefully orchestrated ambush near Midway Atoll. Confident in their momentum and led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Japanese assembled their elite strike force, including 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. What Japan didn't know was that American cryptanalysts had broken their naval codes. US Admiral Chester Nimitz knew when and where the attack would come. As Japanese bombers pounded Midway Island on June 4th, American carriers lay hidden, waiting for their moment. That moment came when US dive bombers found the Japanese carriers vulnerable. Flight decks cluttered with refueling aircraft and munitions. In a span of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were engulfed in flames. Hiryu struck back, damaging the USS Yorktown, but was sunk the next day. By June 7th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had been destroyed. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were killed, including many of the Navy's most experienced aviators. The defeat was catastrophic. Not only had Japan lost 4 carriers and dozens of planes, but the blow to its naval aviation arm was irreplaceable. Unlike the United States, which would soon churn out new ships and pilots at astonishing speed, Japan lacked the industrial base to recover. Midway marked the end of Japan's offensive in the Pacific. Never again would it seize the strategic initiative. The psychological shock was immense. The Japanese military kept the full extent of the loss hidden from public eye. Even high-ranking officers were initially shielded from the truth. The aura of invincibility, the sense that the rising sun couldn't be stopped, was shattered in one brutal stroke. For the Allies, Midway was a pivotal turning point. Coming just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, it was a vindication of American resilience and a huge morale booster. US commanders hailed it as the beginning of the end for Japan. In Tokyo, the mood was somber. The Kirobutai, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, was gone. The Pacific War would now be a long retreat. Well, that's it for our list today, and make sure to let us know which entry you found the most interesting and most informative, and if we missed anything in the comments section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.